In the last 50 years, a growing conflict between gun right activists and gun control advocates has emerged as a conflict between an individual right and a collective right, shifting the common interpretation of the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. With the extreme polarization on the issue of gun control both in American public opinion and the political world, will it be possible to find a compromise to address the need to protect our society against the exploding gun violence? In order to understand the seemingly unsolvable conflict, it is important to understand why the wording and time period of one historical document, the U.S. Constitution, has left two opposing interpretations of the law and has divided American politics. In the earliest days of the birth of the United States as a nation, when the Constitution was being drafted, the country was divided into two, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists believed in a strong national government and wanted a large standing army with the militia firmly under control of the federal government. The Anti-Federalists, after facing British oppression for numerous years, believed in strong state governments and their state militias. The Anti-Federalists strongly opposed the idea of the Constitution because they believed a strong central federal government could act as a monarchical system, usurping the rights of the states and the people and possibly using its military power to oppress them. Many at that time, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, believed that a national army of full-time paid troops could be mounted only when necessary to fight foreign enemies. For other emergencies or crises, militia formed of everyday civilians, armed with their own weapons and receiving unpaid, part-time military training could be used. By 1775, more than half of American colonists owned guns. More Americans owned guns than shares or books. At the time, firearms were mostly purchased for hunting, self-defense, and protection against bandits and Indians. They were also used to reinforce domain over property, and for Southerners, property meant slaves. The main utilization of guns in the South was not focused on combating an overpowerful government, but rather enforcing rules on slaves to ensure that they would not run away or riot. Federalists passed the amendments of the Bill of Rights as a compromise to calm the Anti-Federalist fears and to successfully ratify the Constitution. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights were ratified in 1791. The Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." For almost 200 years, the Americans paid little attention to the Second Amendment. It was rarely used in court proceedings, and its common interpretation was rarely disputed. Today, it is quite the opposite. The conflict has risen from each party focusing on either the well-regulated militia clause, the collective right defended by gun control advocates, or the right of the people clause, the individual right fiercely defended by the gun right activists. In the last 50 years, there has been a drastic shift in the American gun culture and opinion towards the Second Amendment. The issue of gun control has been used by the National Rifle Association and the gun rights activists to support or disqualify political candidates in upcoming elections based on their support to the Second Amendment. Conservative politicians with the powerful lobbying of the National Rifle Association and conservative scholars have convinced the American people that until now the Second Amendment has been wrongly interpreted and should be re-examined under its original intent of a strict construction. They claim the Second Amendment must be read as it was written in its original context, and any departure from its original meaning is wrong. They have narrowly focused on the right of the people clause. The originalist scholars will argue that these words enshrine their individual constitutional right, their unalienable right to keep and bear arms for their self-preservation, leaving out a well-regulated militia in the argument. They will also point out at the British Bill of Rights of 1689 that gave the Protestants the right to be armed to protect themselves against the Catholic oppression, and to argue that the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was a heritage of the self-defense right, a God-given right to every man. Today, most American gun owners claim that gun control laws are an encroachment on their constitutional right to bear arms, an attack on their liberty. They believe more guns mean more self-protection. The shift of the conservative position in the gun owners towards the originalist interpretation of the Second Amendment culminated in 2008 and was set in stone by the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in the Columbia v. Heller case. As expressed in Justice Antonin Scalia's opinion, the 5-4 majority justices concluded that the language and history of the Second Amendment show that it protects a private right of individuals to have arms for their own defense, not a right of the states to maintain a militia. This is an unprecedented shift in the position of the judges who until then overwhelmingly read the Second Amendment as an authorization of the states to form militia. Indeed, the gun control advocates will point out a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state clause to argue that the right to keep and bear arms refers to a civic duty to protect the security and order of the state, an individual right in the context of a collective body for a collective cause. They will point at the crucial role that the militia played at the birth of America and in its infancy when called upon. As expressed by the 4 justices in their dissent to the Heller ruling, the Second Amendment protects only the right of the people of each of the several states to maintain a well-regulated militia. They also argue that even if the Second Amendment did protect an individual right for self-defense, it shouldn't be interpreted as forbidding the government to ban handguns. For most of American history, regulation of guns was a matter of state law. Before the introduction of the 14th Amendment and the Constitution and the development of the doctrine of incorporation, the Second Amendment applied only to the federal government, leaving the states regulating the guns as suited. Even after ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1876, a Supreme Court ruling in the United States versus Cruikshank claimed that the First and Second Amendments did not apply to the state governments and therefore could not be infringed by the state legislature. However, in 2010, a Supreme Court ruling invalidated a state handgun ban regulation in the McDonald versus City of Chicago case. The court reasoned that because of its holding in the Heller case, the Second Amendment applied to the states. Justice Samuel Alito stated that rights that are fundamental to the nation's scheme of ordered liberty, or that are deeply rooted in this nation's history and tradition, are appropriately applied to the states through the 14th Amendment. The court recognized in Heller that the right to self-defense was one such fundamental and deeply rooted right. In the 20th century, with the growing urbanization of the cities, state-level regulation became insufficient to respond to gun violence. During the Prohibition, a wave of violence caused by gangsters like Al Capone erupted throughout the U.S. It prompted Franklin Delano Roosevelt to sponsor the National Firearms Act, the first federal law that authorized the taxation of certain types of guns. In 1968, after the assassination of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, the Congress enacted the Gun Control Act, one of the most comprehensive gun control laws in history. It banned the possession of firearms by felons and drug users, regulated the interstate commerce of firearms, and required licensed gun dealers to report gun sales. The next significant law was the Brady Bill, passed in 1993, that mandated a background check on buyers before a firearm purchase from a federally licensed dealer, manufacturer, or importer. The bill was named after James Brady, the press secretary under Reagan, who was shot during the attempt of President Reagan's assassination in 1981. Since the massacre of Columbine High School in Colorado, mass shootings in schools and other places have occurred at a faster pace, with more violence and more deaths. Today there are about 35,000 people who die every year from gun violence. Today, extreme positions on both sides of the argument seem to dominate the debate, and yet it doesn't reflect the majority of the American public opinion. Although most Americans have relied on the police and law enforcement for their safety, it is incontestable that a clear majority, even within the gun control advocate community, sees the Second Amendment as a self-defense right and thus recognizes the right of the people to own guns. The Heller and McDonald U.S. Supreme Court rulings have ingrained the right to keep and bear arms as a fundamental individual right that can't be infringed at the federal and state levels. It doesn't mean, however, that common sense laws should not be enacted. After all, not many people argue that buckling a seatbelt is absurd. Sensible limits and reasonable measures born from the desire to increase public safety are not absurd and should not be discredited for the sake of encroaching our liberty. Let's not forget that rights come with responsibilities, and it is the responsibility of our government to bound our rights by some reasonable limits to make our society safer, and it is our responsibility as citizens to make sure that these laws are reasonable and common sense.